So what stories do I use in Little Red Wolf? Well, let's talk about part one. So the way I ended up writing a lot of my books, especially the larger novels, is I break it up into smaller sections. Not just chapters, but I'll have a part one, a part two, a part three. It's kind of like a book within a book. The first Little Red Wolf book has 4 parts. And each part is like a D&D campaign or a D&D adventure, where the whole book is the campaign, and each section of the book is like a module within the greater campaign. So it's broken up into 4 parts. This is also good for just structuring the book, making it so that people feel like they've reached goals when they hit it. And it's way easier for editing purposes because you edit, here's part 1, let's edit part 1. And then you go, let's edit part 2. And so instead of having somebody, 112,000 words, I go, here's 30,000 words. Edit that. It's more manageable. It costs less money up front. It causes people who are not really strong readers to want to actually take on just those pieces of it. It's good overall. So part 1 is the introduction. The day in the life of, the introduction of the characters. Crossing the threshold happens several times, really. So in your traditional story, you have a crossing of the threshold, a call to action, refusal of the call, and then crossing the threshold. In Star Wars, this is, Luke goes after the droid. He is called to action by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who says, you need to come to Alderaan with me and go rescue Princess Leia. And Luke initially refuses. He's like, no, I can't do that. I got to go home. It's late. I'm in for it as it is. And so that is the refusal. And then he gets home, and home has been destroyed. And so he goes back and accepts the call. Now, in Star Wars, in the first Star Wars especially, the crossing of the threshold is not one singular event. It's multiple events. He crosses the threshold a little bit when he goes off to rescue the droid. He crosses the threshold again when he goes to Obi-Wan and says, I'm ready to go. He crosses the threshold into the Mos Eisley Cantina. He crosses the threshold into the Millennium Falcon. And then once they've taken off from the planet, we have really crossed the threshold at that point. And there are multiple thresholds to cross. And the first Little Red Wolf book does that too. So, my day in the life of is Selena is hunting, which demonstrates, by the way, this is how you avoid Mary Sue territory. Right there, I am demonstrating where her expertise is. These are the skills that you're going to take with you for the rest of the book. And any other skill that she acquires along the way or demonstrates along the way either has to come back to these skill sets or she has to acquire them at some point. For example, Selena's illiterate. Nobody in her village, well, okay, maybe her dad knows how to read. And Asagi probably knows how to read, but Selena doesn't know how to read. And so she starts to learn how to read, but she's never any good at it. It's one of those things where she can read a few words, but she can't read a book. That's just not a thing that she's really going to be able to do. She can't read, And so, as a result of that, there are sections of the book, most of the book, nobody cares about the fact that she can't read, but every once in a while, it's like, oh yeah, that's right, she's illiterate. Now, I could have had a training montage where she learns how to read and now she knows how to read for the rest of eternity. But instead what I did was, well, she spends some time and she gets a few words, and as time goes on, she'll occasionally be like, I think that word says that, but I could be wrong. Or she'll just look at the sign and be like, she recognized a couple of the words, but it was the picture that told her what it was. So that is a limitation placed upon the character right from the start of the story. So she has a limited worldview because she comes from this little village that's so tiny it doesn't really even have a name. And part one of the book really introduces a lot of this stuff. This is what she does in her day-to-day life. Here's what she's expected to do in her day-to-day life. Here's what she actually does in her day-to-day life. You know, she's in a village that's an actual patriarchy. Like, if you want to know the proper definition of a patriarchy, don't listen to whatever some political pundit says. An actual patriarchy is where Selena lives. She's not allowed to own property because she's a woman. Her sisters find, her eldest sister marries a man and loves him very much and has a traditional relationship. She's not worried about owning the property because her husband owns the property. She just lives there and helps maintain it and stuff like that. Her sister Valora, on the other hand, she gets surrounded by marrying an older man, and she's a gold digger. She marries an older man, and when he dies, she inherits. Class action gold digger. Selena, not so much. Selena isn't going to marry anybody, and that's where the first problem she really runs into is the fact that, you know, she doesn't want to get married. And her husband's like, or her father's like, look, if you don't get married, really bad things are going to happen to you here. And the father isn't a bad character. He's a good man. He's trying to figure out a way to make it so that his most headstrong daughter is not harmed due to her own pig-headedness and stubbornness. And he says at one point, you are one bad harvest away from a witch burning. I mean, if you don't think these people will blame you because you're the unnatural one, you know, it's like, yeah, of course they will at some point. Now, would they actually have, like, burned her at the stake? Probably not. Selena's village is way, you know, not nearly as hardcore as he makes it out to be. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means it's very unlikely to happen. Also, with Asagi in her corner, it's very unlikely that that's really what's going to happen. But you still have the threat and the lack of power and the fact that if she marries some ding-dong that goes and gets himself killed, now she's a widow, and widows can own property. So, you know, it's not perfect, but it's the way things work in her village. And this sets up her, the filter that she sees the world through. Because that's a big thing. Postmodernism and things like that, they have a bad habit of looking at the wrong part of something really important. Before all the crazy woke stuff really got going, when I was in college, the big thing was about lens. It was, you had a feminist lens. You had a romantic lens. Your perception colors your reality. And so even if you are handed all the correct information, it doesn't matter if you can't see it because it gets filtered through your lens. Now, the initial idea of being woke, of waking up, is waking up to the idea that your perceptions are flawed, and therefore you have to spend extra effort to pay attention to the fact that you have a biased perspective. And the first thing you're going to do is information that comes in is going to hit your bias filter. Then you can start to overcome that, but you have to work at it. And Selena has to go through that. She sees everything from the eyes of a 17-year-old who's in this village that has a lot of rules, and a lot of those rules state that as a woman, she's not allowed to do certain things. And that's not fair. But that's the thing that children always say. Well, that's not fair. Well, then you get a little older and you learn how society works, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah. It's not fair, but technically nothing's really fair. And so you got to figure out how to make your way in that society. And that's part of what Selena does. She starts to make her way in the world. And one of the main ways to do that is to cross the threshold several times, get out there, and start to actually find out what the world is really like. Once she finds that out, a lot of her initial bitching and complaining kind of fades away because she's not whining anymore. Now she's like, oh, that's a real threat. And once you know what a real threat is, suddenly the whining and complaining just seems like whining and complaining. And that's part of growing up. All right, I gotta go work. Growing up sucks.